Good evening and welcome. My name is Heather Bullock, and I'm the Acting Dean of the Social Sciences at the University of California, Santa Cruz. It is so wonderful to be here with you tonight. Thank you to everyone who is joining us in person and virtually for our 2023 Confronting Climate Change event, Heat, Climate Change, and Human Health. I extend special thanks and a warm welcome to tonight's brilliant speakers. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise. I know we will learn so much from each of you. I want to begin by sharing this land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking UP tribe. The Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. Climate change is one of the most pressing issues facing us. Confronting Climate Change, an annual public lecture series that is a collaboration of the physical and biological sciences and the social sciences, responds to the many challenges associated with climate change by bringing together scientists, artists, policy experts, and concerned community members to discuss our planet's well-being and share solutions for our collective future. Underscoring the urgency and significance of climate change, this annual event typically draws more than 500 attendees. I know hundreds of people are currently joining us via Zoom. Tonight, we will examine the increasing impact of climate change on human health and how we can respond to these challenges with creativity, compassion, and a commitment to social justice. Our presenters will illuminate the social and economic transformations that are required to address the health impacts of climate change, and together we will consider how climate change could inspire us to work toward a more livable future. Each speaker will give individual presentations and then join together in discussion. We are delighted to once again hold this event at the Seymour Marine Discovery Center. With its exceptional public programming and research, the Seymour Center is at the forefront of teaching about the importance of conservation of the world's oceans. Let me share a few housekeeping details to guide us. For those joining remotely, we're using a webinar tool this evening, so please submit your questions into the Q&A box. You are invited to enter those at any time, and there will be time set aside at the end of the panel discussion for questions. For those in the room, our event staff will provide you with cards to write your questions on. Our event staff will pick them up from you and pass them on to be sorted for the moderator. Closed caption is enabled for our virtual guests, and tonight's event will be recorded. We are incredibly fortunate that our moderator for tonight's program is Professor Andrew Mathews. Andrew is a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His scholarship examines the culture of environmental institutions and connections among local communities and national and global levels of power and knowledge. He also studies and teaches about environmental bureaucracies, climate change modelers, biomass energy, and forest fires in Italy and California. His most recent book is Trees Are Shapeshifters: How Cultivation, Climate Change, and Disaster Create Landscapes. This important work examines the historical ecology, natural history, and climate politics of Italian forests, and how climate change is experienced and acted upon in a landscape that is transformed by humans. If you haven't already done so, you have got to read this book. I cannot imagine a more ideal moderator for tonight's program than Andrew. Please join me in welcoming Professor Andrew Mathews, who will introduce our distinguished speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, for that extremely generous introduction. Well, it's really a pleasure to have you all here for the event, both those in the room and far away. And before we got started, I just want to sort of recognize the support from the divisions of social sciences and natural sciences, because that's the collaboration that makes this possible. And I also want to really call out this Pamela Dewey, who did all of the logistical and planning support and prevented me from going crazy with all of this. So, and she made it actually kind of fun. So thank you, Pam. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce our three speakers, because our housekeeping is well taken care of, and say a few words about each of them. So our first speaker is Dr. Matthew Huber. He's a professor and director of the Institute for a Sustainable Future at Purdue University, where he's responsible for something like 250 other researchers. He was telling us about that, but he looks remarkably calm, so magical powers. An additional special thing about him is that he actually holds a PhD from UCSC in the Department of Earth Sciences, so we're happy to have him back here. Professor Huber's interests range across the past, present, and future climates, the mechanisms that govern climate, and the different forms that climates can take on Earth and on other planets. I think today we're talking about Earth, but we can ask about the rest. But he's someone who thinks about the very long-term effects of climate on ecosystems through paleoclimate modeling and paleoceanography, and of climate change in the present through studies of heat stress, of regional climate, and how these things impact humans. So of particular interest for us today is his work on the limits of human adaptability to heat stress. And there's a pivotal 2010 article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where he and his collaborators really alerted a lot of us to the impacts of heat on vulnerable people who live and work outdoors, both in the global south and, of course, also in what we like to call the global north. He's someone who thinks with big models, but he has this ecologist's eye for thinking about how the details make a difference to living beings, humans included, right? And he's really opening up important questions on how perhaps we might make landscapes more resilient or safer in the face of climate change. So we're really fortunate to have you here, Matt. Our second speaker is Professor Julie Livingston. She is the Julius Silver Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and History at New York University. Her work is at the intersections of history, anthropology, and public health. She is concerned with the human body as a moral condition and mode of consciousness, care as a social practice, taxonomy and the relationships that subvert or append it, the relationship between species, African thought, and political and moral imagination, and the environmental consequences of capitalism and economic growth. So her most recent book, Self-Devouring Growth, is and it's due 2019, so it's quite recent, is really one of those rather rare academic books that is truly a pleasure and delight to read. So I really say, go out and buy it and read it, because it's one of those books that you would read it at your bedside table, kind of for fun. You have to have a certain kind of temperament, but, right? No, it's a really fantastic book. So using the example of Botswana, she shows us how an unchecked and unsustainable global pursuit of economic growth threatens catastrophic environmental destruction. What is required, she tells us, is a greater accounting of the web of relationships between humans, non-human beings, plants, and minerals that growth entails. Professor Livingston is the recipient of numerous awards, more than I could recount today, but I'll just mention that in 2013 she was named a MacArthur Fellow. I also wanted to prepare you by telling you that today she will be talking about the distressing topic of climate change and suicide. And our third and last speaker is Professor Bharat Venkat, who's an assistant professor at UCLA's Institute for Society and Genetics with a joint appointment in the Department of History. His research focuses broadly on questions related to science and medicine, ethics, race, environment, and design. His first book, At the Limits of Cure, came out with the Duke University Press in 2021 and is the winner of the prestigious Joseph Elder Prize in Indian Social Sciences. Dr. Venkat's current project, A History of Heat in a Hot Place, studies the relationship between heat, bodies, and the built environment. Drawing on archival, ethnographic, and oral historical materials, as well as climatological and cartographic data. This research seeks to study the experience of thermal inequality in contemporary India and in the United States. This project also traces the history of studying heat and its effects on the body in the 20th century, helping us situate our recent interest in heat caused by climate change into this longer-term perspective. And as if all this was not enough, Dr. Venkat also directs the UCLA Heat Lab, where he mentors a diverse group of students invested in researching thermal inequality and justice from a really wide range of disciplinary approaches. Students in the lab have worked on things like racialized distribution of green space in Los Angeles, the exposure of migrant laborers to heat stress, the development of climate-focused curricula for high schoolers, and the history of clothing design in colonial India. He helps us to think about how climate change might be experienced and confronted in California. So we're just really fortunate to have you here and looking forward to what you have to say. And our first speaker is Matt Huber. So step forward, Matt.
All right, well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start by doing something that may be covering something that you're all already familiar with, but I think it's always important to discuss. And that's just a reminder that climate change is real. We observe it. It's can be reconstructed very cleanly over the past 150 years, and it can be reconstructed going much further than that. There's not any question that it's happening. This is global mean surface temperature phrased as a difference from a mean value around the 1950s. So blue means colder than it was in the 1950s. Red means warmer than it was in the 1950s. There is no slowing down noted. It is a real thing, and that is all I'm going to say on that topic. We also know what's causing it. This is atmospheric CO2 concentrations as measured at Mauna Loa in Hawaii since 1957. And yeah, it clearly is going up every year, and the rise in greenhouse gas concentrations is warming the planet. This is, again, something we observe. We know this to be true. The underlying physics by which this changes climate's been known since at least 1896, if not before that. So there's really nothing new in terms of knowing that doing this warms the planet quite substantially. And we also know what's causing those changes in CO2, and it's us. It's the sum and total product of our existence is basically to release greenhouse gases. One could try and ascribe to one country or another, who's responsible or what source is more important than another source. And I wouldn't really get bogged down in those details. And I would just note that the amount of CO2 that we release every year increases, and every amount that we add makes the planet warmer. So I think it's important to always start there, because that is the starting point for the rest of the discussion. In what I'm going to show you next, I am going to be relying on the output from models of climate change, and those models are based in physics. These are not statistical models. They are not extrapolated models. We start off with physical equations, and we drive those equations with things like greenhouse gas concentrations, and those equations predict what's going to happen next in terms of climate. We break it's a little bit like Minecraft. We kind of break the whole world up into little boxes, and those little boxes move heat and radiation and water around and generate weather. And when you run the models for long enough, if you average over weather, you get climate. So that's what a climate model is. It's just a whole bunch of physics-based equations, and we run them on very big computers. And it's kind of an amazing feat of physical sciences that doing something as simple as that can predict climate quite well. And I'll just give you an example of output from a climate model. This is something that looks very much like, satellite weather. The colors here are temperatures predicted from physical equations for the surface of the ocean. And the things that look like clouds, well, they're basically clouds. It's water vapor in the atmosphere that's being moved around due to the physics in the equations. And occasionally you'll see a little thing like labeled storm something. So those are tropical cyclones. Those are hurricanes that form spontaneously in these models, just because it's there in the physics. Okay, so this is a simulation by NASA. They've got big computers and smart people, and they project ahead into the future, but there's modeling groups around the world who all do the same thing, and those form the basis for our predictions of what's going to happen in the future. But in order to do that, it's not just all physics, it's also human decisions. And I think that's very important to recognize. I'm not sure if, it depends on your background. I'm a physical scientist. I look at this and I say, oh, clearly human decisions. Most of you may look at this and say, I see some numbers and some colors and some lines. What am I looking at? So that's fair, right? I look at these all day long. But I just want, so looking at the thing on the left here, this is time in years going forward in time to the year 2100, which is usually how we do it. And this is the amount of global warming that we expect measured in degrees C. And the different colors represent different scenarios. Optimistic scenarios about how greenhouse gases will be increased by humans. So do we just transition to a green economy and stop emitting? To more pessimistic scenarios where we just go along with our normal policies for a long period of time. And if we do that, we end up at the top of this graph with warming of more than 4 degrees C. If you think in Fahrenheit, just double it, it's close enough. And that's the global mean surface temperature. Any given region is going to vary away from that. And as I'm going to try and get across to you, like any one of these is a possible future, and it's our decisions that are going to decide which of those paths we're on. And I really hope that at the end of this, that you'll be convinced that we need to do something to make sure that we're on the lowest of these paths. And I hope it'll be self-evident. Ways to do that are indicated on the right, but I'm not going to spend any time covering that. But there's a lot of things, policies that we know can be enacted, probably should be enacted, to get us at the lower end of global warming. Now, like I said, I'm a physical scientist. That's what I do. I show you graphs, I show you equations, I expect you to understand. And that doesn't always work. But so even if that's not working for you, what I'd like you to do is, as I go through this, I'd like you to just note in your head or on a piece of paper or in the chat or something, some of the things that you think or feel, like literally just words, okay? Not anything complicated, but just word pictures, if you will. And the reason is because, as I'm going to show you, I actually don't know the right words to describe what I'm going to show you. And I don't mean that just like I get emotional. I mean, I actually don't think we have developed a vocabulary for describing the future. I think we don't know how to talk about this. So, climate change in a nutshell is pretty simple. You add CO2, things get warmer. The more you add, the worse it gets. That much is simple. But I'm going to talk now specifically about heat and heat stress and its impact on people. And I'm coming at this from a background studying climate change over the past 65 million years. All right? And the climate change that we are currently embarking on is comparable in magnitude to the kinds of changes you see in geological time. We are sort of a force of nature. Okay, we're changing the planet. And after having spent years thinking about how the poles are going to change and how the world is going to change, it really came to roost in my head that we really need to be thinking about the hot places, not just what's going to happen to polar bears on ice floes, but what about the tropics? What about the subtropics? In many cases, you're talking about communities or regions that have contributed the least to climate change, and as I'll show you, may suffer the most from it. and that we need to be spending a lot of time thinking about that part of the problem. And so I started to get active. I started to do things like write op-ed pieces in the New York Times to raise awareness on this. And I wrote a paper, as was alluded to earlier, about the limits to the ability of human beings to adapt to a hotter world. And at the time, it was theoretical. I was really not thinking as everyone's going to be interested. But it's had a huge impact, and in fact, books have been written where the first chapter is based on something that I wrote about purely as a scientist. It never occurred to me that that was going to happen. The physical picture is really simple. You lose 80 to 90% of the heat when you're hot due to sweating, okay? So if you can't sweat away your heat, you just slowly get hotter and hotter. You generate heat, you're all generating about 80 watts just sitting here, your metabolic heat, right? If you get on because of COVID, I ended up getting I get an elliptical trainer, and now I know exactly how many watts I generate doing anything, right? Like, I think we all have experience with that. So you have metabolic heat generation, you have to lose it. Your primary way of losing it is through sweating. So there's a variable, again, it's a sciencey thing, it's called wet bulb temperature. And the wet bulb temperature is the temperature that air can come to if you're losing as much heat through evaporation as you possibly can. So that sets a limit to how much heat you can possibly lose as a function of the amount of heat and water vapor in the air. And we'll get to that in a second. But it's just basically you lose your heat through sweating, and we have things that we can calculate that tell you when you're not going to be able to do that anymore. And the key thing there is it's all about heat and humidity. It's not just, if it's Arizona, it's 115 degrees out, you're fine. You can run a marathon. I couldn't, but some people could. So if you combine heat and humidity, the situation gets much worse. And I would just like to point out, we're already in a world where this sort of thing is affecting people, right? So, for example, the World Cup, more than 6,000 people died due to heat stress building those buildings, all right? So, how would you feel going in there knowing, that was a good football game, but by the way, 6,000 people died, right? I think a lot of people don't know that happened. This is something that we're dealing with in the world today, and we don't talk about it, and we need to. This was in The Economist last week. The combination of heat and humidity is ramping up, and it's a problem currently in India and Pakistan right now. And so I just want to introduce you to how this works. Again, this is a sciencey type plot. The numbers on the bottom, 36, 38, 40, those are in degrees C, and those are wet bulb temperatures. That's this kind of magic number that combines heat and humidity. And all those little dots are people who were involved in totally legit experiments where their health parameters were measured, and the heat and humidity was adjusted, and they measured at what point did their internal body temperature start rising without limit, and then they stop the experiment. They don't continue. And so when the heat and humidity reaches this critical wet bulb temperature of just around 31 degrees C, people start not being able to compensate anymore. They can't sweat enough to lose their heat. So what this means, just to be clear, is if you were to sit in that room for 6 hours, your internal body temperature would rise, you would suffer heat stroke, and if you stayed in that room, you would die. Okay? So that happens around 31. This is not the kind of normal temperature that you're used to. This is wet bulb temperature. So you could ask the question, as climate changes, what fraction of the year might people start experiencing those kinds of wet bulb temperatures? And so this is now looking, so for 1.5 degrees of global warming, keep in mind we're at 1.25 degrees of global warming right now. So when we say 1.5 degrees of warming, we're talking 20 or 30 years from now. or one big El Nino. This is 2 degrees of global warming, 3 and 4. And what I'm plotting here is the number of hours every year that would be experienced above that threshold, where if you sat in that for 6 hours, you would die, or at least end up in the hospital. And I'm going to zoom in on this, but just note the large patterns. And now let me just show you like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. At 1.5 degrees of warming, it's, say, 3 or 8 hours in those peak regions. And I don't want to minimize that, but let's just say I can imagine people avoiding going outside for 3 to 8 hours a year. Like, again, as I've indicated, I don't know the right words, but I'm just saying, when I look at this, I say to myself, I can imagine that not being so bad. But then as you get to 2, and then 3, and then in 4, and you're saying that there will be weeks out of every year where if people go outside, even doing absolutely no labor, they run the risk of being dead. So what do we call that? I want you to think about that. And don't tell me uninhabitable, okay? Because that's what you would call climate determinism, right? So that's saying we can't adapt. I mean, from that point of view, Alaska is uninhabitable, right? Like, there are things that we can do in the built environment to adapt, right? We can do that. But on the other hand, this is not good. This is really disturbing, and I don't know. I'm writing papers on this, and I literally don't know how to describe this, okay? And I can tell you it matters because whatever I write is going to end up in the New York Times, and it'll be in the headline, right? So if I get it wrong, you make people think that the end of the world is nigh, and that's never good. Or, oh, this is fine, which is also not true. Let's look at West Africa at 3 degrees of warming. I mean, you were talking about hundreds of millions of people. Not good. Interestingly, the US, meh. We're fine until there's 4 degrees of warming, which it's debatable whether that would happen. Okay. So I feel like I'm already, how much time do I have? A minute or two. So that's fine. So what I'm going to do is just show you 1 or 2 things. You can feed those kinds of projections into economic models, and economic models are sort of morally neutral, if you want to, or reprehensible, depending on how you. So I don't want to say that it's all just dollars, all right? But on the other hand, if you can translate things into dollars, there are people who listen, who might not have listened. So I have been funded by World Bank to do some of this, funded by the National Science Foundation to do some of this. I mean, it is helpful. I am in conversations with large corporations, USAID. I mean, they do care about this sort of thing. And what we can do is we can feed this into economic models where trade happens, prices fluctuates, people can move from one mode of labor to another mode of labor, and agriculture can shift, and energy can shift. All this can happen in the model. And so with a 3-degree warming world, you see anywhere that's red, there's a big negative impact, and anywhere it's blue, there's a positive impact. So this is agriculture and this is construction. And you can see West Africa as an example, and Southeast Asia have, a huge negative impact on agriculture due to the fact that it's just hard to work outside under these conditions. Oh, look who benefits. Oh, there's the global north, once again, emerges from this with slight positive outcomes. It's not to say that it's going to be good everywhere, but it's just, if it's better in the US and Canada than it is in Ghana, then there will be trade flows, and the system will actually send money to the places where labor can happen. What this leads to, so we have a poverty module that was built into this model, so we can actually look people right at the threshold from being poor to in serious life-threatening poverty. Massive increases in poverty in West Africa due just to the impact of heat stress on the ability to do labor. So big justice issues, big distributional issues associated with that. And, I don't want to cut into anyone's time, so I will just say that this sort of thing has led me to try and do something about it, which is why I'm director of an institute for a sustainable future. And my hope is that people don't walk out of this going, oh my God, we're all screwed, we can't do anything. Instead, you need to be thinking about what you can do to bend the CO2 curve and to roll out adaptation and mitigation solutions that are just. So, thank you. Do I go up here? Or where should I sit?
We could wait down here.
Okay, I will wait down there. Sounds good.
So our next speaker is Julie Livingston, once reminding us.
And put it in my pocket. Well, thanks so much to Andrew for including me in this conversation, and to Pamela for arranging my visit. She's amazing. And to all of you for coming here and taking the time to think with us. I want to say that I'm going to be speaking about suicide, and I know that that can be a difficult subject for some people in a public space or sitting there on Zoom. So if you prefer to tune me out and I see you looking at your phone rather than looking up, that's fine. Even if you need to leave the room and rejoin us later, you just do what's best for you. Let me get started. In the long shadow of the event, which is the prelude to the next event, life is proving unbearable for some. Following the wildfires and the heat dome in British Columbia in 2021, an emergency room doctor reported that she saw a spate of suicide attempts by young people, driven by the fear that they will never outlive the climate disasters and global warming. In Puerto Rico, for more than a year following Hurricane Maria, the suicide rate rose precipitously, as did the call volume to the suicide hotline. Clinical psychologist Dr. Carlos del Toro Ortiz told a reporter from the New York Times that in his 2 decades of clinical practice, he had never before hospitalized as many people with suicidal or homicidal thoughts in such a short time period as in the 2 months following the storm. One grandmother told him of her recurrent memories of the terrifying storm itself, mixed with her feelings of anguish at the visceral experience of her home, her possessions, caked in filth, rotting in the heat. She too was having disturbing thoughts of suicide and was worried she may harm herself. Even under calm skies, the weight of it all can prove too much. David Buckle, a 60-year-old white gay man who ran one of the largest carbon-neutral composting sites in the country in the neighborhood of Red Hook in Brooklyn, headed into Brooklyn's Prospect Park on a morning in April 2018, where he proceeded to drench himself with gasoline and set himself ablaze. Having grown increasingly despondent over the environment, Mr. Buckle sent a note to local media ahead of his immolation, which read, "Here is hoping that giving a life might bring some attention to the need for expanded action." These moments offer glimpses into the wide range of climate-related suicide here in North America that mark the deadly and, I believe, escalating psychic toll of our environmental predicament. In this talk with you, I am asking how climate change, a welter of incremental corrosive shifts layered with sudden catastrophic events generated and perpetuated through industrial systems of profit, can get under the skin and into the psyche, what I am calling the embodied mind. For several decades now, a psychiatric paradigm has held primacy in the field of suicidology. But given that more than half of Americans will receive a diagnosis of mental illness or disorder in their lifetime, and that in any given year, 1 in 5 of us will receive a diagnosis of mental illness, perhaps we should pay more attention to what anti-political work this categorization is doing. I ask after the political implications of despair, not to deny the reality of psychic distress, far from it, but instead to ask what happens if we approach these pervasive thoughts and feelings not only as pathological, but also as a meaningful response to our political, ethical, and planetary condition. The effects of pathologizing psychic anguish in the United States are powerful, considering that our mental health services are painfully thin on the ground, racialized, carceral, and heavily pharmaceuticalized. How might self-harm be experienced as the available form of agency by some who feel trapped in the intolerable futility of their position? And most importantly, what other forms of address are needed to open a horizon of possibility? In thinking climate and suicide together, I am not arguing for any sort of linear causation. In fact, I am arguing against simple modes of causal reasoning. Suicides are inherently complicated and ambiguous, and climate change itself entails a complex of political, economic, social, and environmental dynamics. Linear causation narratives can limit our understanding of either problem, much less their relationship with one another. But suicide and environmental devastation are correlated and entangled in troubling ways. At its largest scale, climate change is a gross act of collective murder-suicide unfolding in broad daylight, orchestrated and furthered by powerful interests, scrambling rationality and irrationality, red pills and blue ones. Sometimes people who are forced to live that ugly truth in material terms find the only meaningful action at their disposal is a permanent exit. David Buckle's actions, while extreme, surfaced a zeitgeist of sorts, what some psychologists are calling climate grief. I know this feeling. When my father died mid-pandemic and we gathered to say Kaddish, I remember thinking him lucky. He'd lived his long life. Now he would be spared bearing witness to the unfolding violence to come. The water wars, the crass commodification of breathable air, the ever-expanding sacrifice zones, the militarization of the lithium and cobalt economies, the last panda in a gilded cage, its DNA extracted and preserved for posterity, while a bunch of white supremacists blast off to found a slave colony on Mars. Climate grief, eco-anxiety, solastalgia, new terms are proliferating to capture these widespread feelings of frustration, fear, outrage, and just tremendous sadness. Such feelings might motivate people toward action that is reparative mentally and politically, or they may incapacitate and drain into nihilism and even self-harm. David Buckle's climate anxiety was manifest in both his composting work and in his self-immolation. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among American teenagers. In the decade leading up to the pandemic, so before it began, the proportion of high school students reporting persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness had increased by 40%. In 2019, again before the pandemic, 1 in 11 teens had made an attempt. The pandemic itself, a climate change event, has only deepened matters. Yet, even though young people are in the press, they're not alone. Hopelessness abounds. Suicide is currently the 12th leading cause of death in the United States across all ages. In 2020, some 46,000 people took their own lives amid 1.2 million documented attempts. The majority of gun deaths in this nation of deadly weapons are suicides. Environmental data correlate to the suicide rate. One meta-analysis by a team of Iranian and American scientists reviewed research on the relationship between air pollution and suicide. They found that when concentrations of nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and carbon monoxide, all byproducts of fossil fuel generation, rose in the atmosphere, so did the suicide rate for the next several days. Or take the temperature itself. Researchers have begun to document relationships between rising average temperatures in a given month and the suicide rate. One large study analyzing data from thousands of counties and municipalities in Mexico and the US over several decades found that as average temperatures increase, so do suicides in those locales. They did not find that people adapted over time. The relationship between suicide and temperature continued. Nor did they find that people from hotter or cooler climates were better able to cope with rising average temperatures. Income differences had no bearing on this relationship, nor did higher rates of air conditioning. To put the effect in perspective, the authors project that if temperatures continue to rise by 2050, the effect on the suicide rate in the US and Mexico will be, and this is a quote, roughly 2 to 4 times the estimated effect of a 1% increase in the unemployment rate, end quote. But we might ask, what if unemployment rises too? The setting for this deadly structure of feeling is late capitalism, as the deeply personal manifestations of intertwined environmental, economic, biochemical, and social structures make themselves felt. Here in the US, psychotropic drugs are in widespread use, from elite boarding schools, universities, and gated communities, to nursing homes, jails, prisons, and migrant detention centers, where they are deployed as chemical restraints. National credit card debt stands at approximately $1 trillion, and nearly half of us are unable to cover an unanticipated $400 emergency expense. Decades of deregulated industry and eviscerated safety nets have left many, including the rural poor, particularly vulnerable at a time of rising disaster. Human bodies, animal bodies, water bodies, plant bodies, the organic base of our world are already forever constitutionally altered by the chemical and nuclear exposures that precede them, amid efforts to adapt biologically to a rapidly changing climate. Feminist science studies scholar M. Murphy terms this condition alter life. Harmful exposures are maldistributed along familiar patterns of racial and colonial harm. But the insidiousness of the petrochemical regime means that we are so awash in this shit that there is a baseline toxic embrace that touches everyone at the molecular level by now. We don't really know what this means for the embodied mind. I'll just give you one example among many. Glyphosate, a pesticide associated with increased rates of neurodegenerative disorders, including Alzheimer's, is present at detectable levels in the urine of 99.8% of the French population. So you can only imagine what that means for agricultural workers who are in the flow of it as they do their work. Within that setting, let me give you two examples of feedback loops that help show how suicide and climate are entangled through the embodied mind. The first, psychiatric drugs, operates through chronic, slow time of gradual environmental change, while the second, housing, through the immediacy of the destructive climate event. Let me begin with psychopharmaceuticals, but let me also be clear that I am not anti-drug, nor do I think that drugs are the root cause of our predicament, because again, I don't believe in singular causes. But the mass drugging of the population has done very little to stem the tide of suicide, and in fact, as a technopolitics, may further the problem in the name of its solution. The global market in psychopharmaceuticals had a projected value near $50 billion in 2020, and it continues to rise. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans over the age of 18 is taking a prescribed psychotropic drug, the culmination of decades-long escalation and diagnostic creep and prescription response. For our children, the rate is higher. A large-scale study of nearly 9 million American children aged 2 to 17 in 2020 found that 2019 to 2020, found that on average 28% were taking a prescribed psychotropic medication. Among children in foster care, it's higher still. These drugs are approved for use based on clinical trials that follow their effects as single agents over a short time span. Yet many of us consume these drugs whose biological mechanism remains unknown in perpetuity and in combination. Sometimes drugs are added to drugs in a polypharmaceutical cascade from which it is difficult to break free. As humans consume psychotropic drugs in escalating rates, we excrete these chemicals and their metabolites into the environment, where they persist and accumulate over time. Psychiatric drugs now abound in aqueous environments. They're sedimented into the sludge, the soil, into the tissue of aquatic biota. These drugs have effects on aquatic life. They inhibit the stress response in fish. They affect the locomotor and reproductive systems of mollusks and crustaceans. In other words, efforts to blunt our feelings through drugs have knock-on effects that harm our fellow species on the planet, ultimately contributing to the source of our solastalgia. The Xanax I took in order to be able to stand here and give this talk, like the Wellbutrin you may have taken in order to hear it, will not be thoroughly cleared through Santa Cruz's cogen wastewater treatment system. It'll enter the San Lorenzo River, where it will be taken up by algae, phytoplankton, insects, mollusks, as well as various species of fish. These same drugs and their metabolites may also be feeding back into our own human biochemistry. They're in our tap water. They're in the sludge that becomes our agricultural fertilizer. They're in the fish. They're in the soil. Unfortunately, our scientific expertise is siloed. There's little transdisciplinary conversation between medicine, neuroscience, and aquatic toxicology. But emerging research suggests potential effects on human health. One secondary analysis of pharmaceutical residue in the drinking water in Europe and North America found that if a pregnant person drank an average of 2 liters of tap water per day, they would have a cumulative ingestion of 5% of the clinical dose of Valium or diazepam over the course of their pregnancy. The science that currently governs the dispensing of these drugs does not account for potential bioaccumulation in fish, exposure in utero, or other subclinical registers of accumulation, much less synergies across chemical agents. So that's drugs. Onto housing. Against the backdrop of this kind of pervasive despair and creeping anxiety, broken institutions, and widespread toxicity, a temporal cycle of routinized climate events unfolds. Wildfire season, hurricane season, summer heat waves have become an annual lottery of sorts. Some people are flattened by it, fleeing, coping, navigating a familiar landscape, now rendered unpredictable and perilous. The sudden destruction of the everyday mixes with the exhaustion of managing in the present, the anxiety of an uncertain future, the loss of a nostalgic past. An estimated 50% of the survivors of Hurricane Katrina had PTSD. That means that for some time after the storm, an enormous number of people in New Orleans found themselves irritable, more prone to aggression, unable to sleep well, living constantly vigilant against new threats, and were understandably more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol. Even those who had fled the storm but returned to live among the debris were overwhelmed by miles of devastated landscape, their missing friends, family, pets, drowned homes. The suicide rate was nearly triple what it had been before the storm. It stayed higher than normal for years. One widely reported case concerned a photographer for the Times-Picayune, a middle-aged white man who had kayaked through the city photographing the devastation. But nearly a year after the storm, when he realized he would never get insurance money to rebuild his home, he attempted suicide by cop, leading the police on a car chase, begging them to shoot him. They didn't, but the storm had decimated the city's mental health infrastructure, so his friends begged that he be taken to jail, thinking that he actually would be safer there than in the emergency room. In Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, similar anguish. People were traumatized. They'd been through a terrifying ordeal, separated from loved ones, unsure of their whereabouts, facing ongoing deprivation. Days stretched into weeks, months, and years without electricity, running water, basic services, or assistance. The burden of private property and the thinness, false promise of state services and safety nets, the insults of being abandoned in this way, proved too much for some. Suicidologists have long established statistical correlations between suicide and financial stresses like loss of employment, crushing debt, or foreclosure. And in turn, some have shown that generous social safety nets can help mitigate these effects. But climate crises push deep into these fault lines already created by our system of widespread financial debt, as people might suddenly lose unemployment, housing, their personal effects, and find themselves facing a bevy of unforeseen expenses all at the same time. Housing offers a way to contemplate the complex array of environmental dynamics that interact with this kind of economic and social devastation. When the storm comes, if you're a property owner with a mortgage, you're now facing the overwhelming financial uncertainty that is your home, a possession which had previously been understood as a form of security. If you're a renter, where will you go in a city or town whose housing stock has just been brutally shrunk? How much more will you pay? How much more can you pay? If you were already homeless, well, many New Orleans residents returned to homes with black mold, creeping across surfaces, crawling inside walls, an environmental problem that follows in the wake of flooding, which is exacerbated by rising temperatures. Mold exposure is associated with negative mental health consequences. In the wake of Hurricane Sandy, researchers at Rutgers found that adults in New Jersey who were exposed to mold due to storm damage experienced twice the rate of mental distress as those who were not so exposed. In my own city of New York, where 1 of 15 of us resides in public housing. NYCHA, that's the Public Housing Authority. NYCHA buildings were rife with toxic mold for years after the storm. In New Orleans, people were moved into FEMA trailers that they later learned emitted formaldehyde, a chemical associated with depression, panic attacks, and cognitive impairment. Of course, many predominantly Black, low and middle income New Orleans residents were already living in toxic buildings, including infamously the Press Park public housing development erected by the city on a waste dump, later named a Superfund site. Beyond the traumatic experience of the front line of climate disaster are the background effects of American housing. Preliminary research suggests potential neurotoxic effects from exposure to wildfire smoke, complete with the chemicals emitted from plastics and other synthetic materials burned when fire consumes the American home. I just have a paragraph left. So this is the conclusion. It's where I'm supposed to name the solution. And yet what I want to name is so obvious and yet so out of reach, so I already know you'll feel unsatisfied. But that's all I have to offer you, which is why this was a difficult talk to write. I know that the same politics of deregulation that accelerate our climate predicament have also transformed the human body at the molecular level, even as they have generated intensive social, political, and economic pressures on the psyche. I think that if the interior milieu and the exterior environment are co-constituted, we should address the psychic anguish and despair of our environmental predicament in ways that build a political collective, rather than through narratives of individual pathology, as though we are each uniquely broken. Such an effort will require a new science to account for the embodied mind in the late capitalist system. This would be a science of ultra-life that does not separate the home loan from the effects of black mold, human biochemistry from that of mollusks. A science that does not cleave drugs into the body from those excreted out, does not begin with a pure body and a clinical threshold, but an already exposed body in relation to other already exposed bodies navigating broken institutions. But how can even the most capacious science be realized in a meaningful politics of redress? That is what we must figure out together with our embodied minds if we are to disarm this murder-suicide ongoing in broad daylight. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, very much. And now we have our final speaker, Bharat.
Can folks hear me? Oh, fantastic. So, did a moment for that. Thank you all for having me today. Thank you to Andrew for the invitation and to Pamela for organizing all of this. It's amazing to be in conversation with Julie and Matt. I'm really looking forward to not talking anymore so I can hear from other people. If you'll bear with me, I want to talk to you a bit about how I started to study heat and why. Right? And Matt's presentation was actually quite prophetic in this way. So in the summer of 2015, I was finishing up field work in India for my first book, which is about tuberculosis treatment, what it means to be cured, and why cures fail. So about antibiotic resistance, amongst other things. I traveled across Delhi to hospitals and clinics where I'd been doing my research in the midst of a massive heat wave that resulted in at least 2,500 deaths, probably many, many more. But it's hard to say with any certainty because determining heat as a cause of death is such a difficult thing to do for many reasons. We can talk about that in the Q&A. But like an intrepid field worker, because I was trained as an anthropologist, I tried hard to ignore the heat, right? Because, if I write a book about how I went to India and it's too hot, so I didn't do anything, that doesn't really, doesn't get you tenure for sure, right? So I thought to myself, I'll ignore the heat. It seems bad, but isn't it always bad? It's India, it's hot, right? But then I realized that nobody else was doing that, right? People were responding. So I was going to these hospitals, and they were closed, right? So they were closed during ordinary working hours. Those hospitals that had, one kind of on-call room for doctors with air conditioning, all the doctors would be huddled in that room. The patients were sent home and asked to come back the next day or come back very early in the morning before 6 or very late in the evening. And this is in the midst of quite a serious heat wave. But even in terms of everyday life, I began to realize people were adapting to heat, right? I'm thinking about what they were wearing, what they drank, what they ate, where they went, when they went there. As far as they were able, heat was something people were constantly adapting to, moving around, navigating. And this got me thinking about how important heat is, both in ordinary circumstances, but also under extreme conditions. So case in point, these are images from the NASA Landsat satellite, an invaluable source of climate-related data. These images are of Purdue Lake, which is the main rain-fed reservoir in the southern state of Tamil Nadu, where I did a lot of my research. The photo on the left is from May 31st, 2018. The one on the right is from June 19th, 2019, so just about a year apart. So as you can see, the effects of extreme heat are already present and serious, compounded by failures in the monsoon. So in fact, according to a recent study, there have been over 700 heat waves in India over the last 50 years, which have taken more than 17,000 lives, right? So this is from 1971 to 2019. So 2019 is also when I moved to my current position at UCLA, where I thought I'd be safe from the heat. However, I began to experience heat waves like clockwork year after year, as we all have here in California and across much of the world. And this motivated me to consider how I could study heat as a trans-regional and comparative phenomenon, but one that was not evenly distributed. And this is very key, the fact that heat is not something that we all experience to the same degree in the same way, for a variety of reasons. So in early 2020, I founded the UCLA Heat Lab, which Andrew described a bit. It's a group of 20 students who have taken on a variety of projects focused on heat from a kind of committedly interdisciplinary perspective. It's not something you can study very well if you just insist on sticking to one particular paradigm, one particular mode or model or method. So the thing you have to do is figure out, for this given problem, this given question, what tools do we need to answer this question, right? What are the specific ways we must approach this in order to make sense of the situation? These projects that we've worked on have evolved out of a combination of my own interests and perhaps more importantly, those of my students. I'll talk a bit about what those projects look like in a bit. But first, I want to orient you with these two organizing concepts that have really kind of been at the center of the work we do in the Heat Lab. The first is thermal experience, which refers to how we subjectively or phenomenologically experience heat, how it affects how we think, how we talk about it, and how we respond. This is distinct from more quantitative approaches, things like wet bulb temperature, things like heat index. I'm not saying these are, to my mind, these are complementary approaches, right? Because in some sense, people are shit at knowing how hot they are, right? It is very hard to accurately determine what you're experiencing. And this has been a problem throughout the history, throughout the 20th century. You have histories of, scientists at Harvard building mannequins, hoping that the mannequins can experience heat better than humans can or more accurately, right? There's also, of course, the concern that if you put a human being into, say, a climate control chamber and turn up the heat, they might faint, right? And then they become really bad at telling you what they're experiencing. But one of the kind of central things for me is to understand how are people really thinking about what they're experiencing, even if that capacity to think and respond and sense is, of course, limited, right? And how we take that together with kind of more quantitative approaches. The other kind of key and maybe even more important concept for me is thermal inequality, which refers to the fact that some people are more affected by heat than others. It's very simple. But of course, it matters that some places are historically hotter than others, right? So a place like India, where I was in 2015, where I was 2 weeks ago, Now, Delhi compared to London is, of course, going to be hotter in general. But it's not just about how hot it is, right? And Matt kind of gestured towards this. It matters who has air conditioning. It matters who has to work outside or in a warehouse, who has to wait at the bus stand in the sun, who, in other words, is more likely to suffer adverse health effects from heat, who is more likely to be hospitalized or have access to appropriate health care. So our aim in the lab is to understand how certain kinds of people and certain kinds of bodies and communities have been actively made more vulnerable to the effects of heat. One image I always think of as someone who is trained in South Asian studies, someone who does work in India, is the pankavala or the fan puller from colonial India. Here, Indians were made to work the fan so that British administrators, overlords, could enjoy the relative cool inside. Here you actually see folks operating these fans that are inside the building with their feet, right? But what this image really invokes for me is the sense that thermal comfort for some is purchased at the expense of others, right? We can think of this in more kind of mundane, everyday ways. If you buy strawberries at the grocery store, we can only do that because others, largely migrant farm workers from Central America, are asked to work in hot fields, right? Even more mundane, if you order Uber Eats, right, on a day that's too hot to go outside, you're doing that so that somebody else has to go and retrieve that food for you and bring it to you. And these are all kind of really small examples, but I think it points to the ways in which thermal comfort is distributed quite unevenly, and often somebody has to pay so that you can enjoy your coolness, right? Another important aspect of thermal inequality are those downstream effects that don't look to be heat-related on first glance, but are nevertheless tied to heat, right? So here you see Aedes aegypti, which is a kind of mosquito. It's a vector for Zika, chikungunya, yellow fever, dengue, amongst other kinds of diseases. As certain parts of the world get warmer, the geographic range of these mosquitoes is changing, both expanding but also kind of transforming. Infectious disease, then, is a possible consequence of increasing heat, but not for everyone to the same degree, right? So I think what this points to and what everyone's been saying is that it's not just about heat stress, right? It's not just about the effects of the body that are directly from heat, but also about a range of downstream consequences that are kind of hard to see unless you're really kind of looking for them. So I want to focus with the remainder of my time here on two LA-based projects that I've been doing with the UCLA Heat Lab that underscore how thermal inequality is tied to race and class. The first focuses on occupational thermal environments. It's a fancy way of saying how hot is it at work, right? So during the height of the pandemic, food trucks became a really important source of meals for many of my students at UCLA as indoor dining halls were closed down. So my students wanted to understand how hot it got inside of these trucks. They had an intuition, from going to these trucks every day that these were really kind of hot metal boxes. So what was it really like in there? So we began by using eye buttons, which are these small thermometric sensors placed throughout trucks on UCLA campus to get a read on how hot it really was in these food trucks. We placed eye buttons near the food prep area in the food truck, as well as near the serving window area and near the hot cooking elements. You can see there's quite a variation in how hot it gets within a truck, right? The maximum temperature recorded was 109 degrees Fahrenheit near the cooking area. And in fact, it would often stay above 100 degrees for several hours in the day, right? And keep in mind, this is even within one food truck, you have a huge range of temperatures depending on where you are in that and what kind of work you're doing. So what produced these conditions? Obviously, it matters that it's hot outside, right? So outdoor temperatures are critical. Body heat matters. How many workers are inside of the food truck? Of course, the heat produced by the cooking element itself, right? So if you're over the stove, if you've spent time in a kitchen, you've experienced this yourself to some degree. However, there were also structural issues related to design that exacerbated the heat. So AC units were frequently near the ceiling, and workers told us that the cold air flowed directly out through exhaust vents. Right? Back doors were kept closed, right? So food trucks have these back doors, in part because workers were concerned about being mugged, right? Being robbed or assaulted, but primarily due to food safety regulations that prohibited leaving these doors open, right? The fear was that flies would come in and enter into your food. Right? So what this revealed to us was a real tension between how regulators thought about food safety and occupational health, right? And so it kind of pitted the health of the customer against the health of the worker. And in this case, the health of the customer was primary, right? So we interviewed workers to get a sense of how they experience this heat. Workers frequently work alone or in pairs, so taking a break is incredibly difficult. So they're working long hours continuously, often without even a bathroom break is a real challenge, right? One food truck worker told us it gets to the point where you just feel nauseous, and what's happening is you're forcing yourself to drink water even when you're not even thirsty. Your stomach hurts. Sometimes you get sick to your stomach because you're really, really hot, right? But workers also spoke of their grit and their ability to endure these conditions. And this is quite interesting for us, because we're kind of always on the lookout for people saying, it's too hot to work, this is terrible. But instead we were hearing, we can handle it, right? We even heard from a few truck owners that they hire people who they thought intuitively could, quote, take the heat, right? When we asked them what that meant, they told us, unsurprisingly, Black, Latinx, and Asian American workers were thought to be more heat resilient, and that white workers tended to faint on the job or quit after a few days, right? We also heard this from workers themselves who talked, for example, about their Mexican or Indonesian heritage, making them able to withstand the heat. One worker from Mexico even told us that he could go through a whole 8-hour shift with no breaks. So this idea of racialized resilience to heat is an old one. There's nothing new here. This was used to justify slavery. The idea that black folks were more suited to work in plantation fields under the severe heat, white folks were more suited to kind of overseer roles, right? Vulnerability actually made you better suited to kind of be an administrator or an overseer, or, this is the kind of logic that was very explicitly used to justify slavery, as well as indenture. So this was a global logic. This logic actually, you can trace its history all the way into our present moment, right? So if we think about, for example, the history of Filipino plantation workers in Hawaii, black folks in the automotive industry in Detroit, Latinx workers in fields, all of this has been explicitly justified. I mean, you can see this in industry documentation, you can see this in scholar literature through ideas of a differential racial vulnerability and resilience to heat, right? And it's often this kind of this dire vulnerability that's ascribed to white bodies that allows white bodies to justify a kind of place in the hierarchy, right? So in this is kind of one of the rare instances where being less good at something lets you, justify that you should therefore be exempt in some ways, right? That you are in the most superior role through your kind of fragility, right? So I want to talk very briefly about another project in progress involving the UCLA Heat Lab and two of my great colleagues at UCLA, Kelly Turner and Mark Vestal. And I wrote a little bit about this in an op-ed in the LA Times, again, trying to find a language for describing all of this, right? So this project is focused in Watts, a primarily Black and Latinx neighborhood in LA, where temperatures are about 4.7 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than the city average. An important thing to know about Watts is that it's an area that has been affected by the legacy of redlining. And we know that redlined areas, especially those that remain homes to large black and brown communities, tend to be hotter than nearby white neighborhoods. And this is not entirely ascribable to just geographical location, right? It's really about the built environment and other kinds of factors. So this is unfortunately a very good example of the ways in which thermal inequality tends to build on pre-existing forms of inequality. In this case, inequalities premised on race and class. Right? Decades of disinvestment have resulted in communities of color in Watts living in an area with more concrete, less green space, and less shade than their white neighbors, which means that these areas are far hotter as well. Most of the residents of Watts are also renters, which means they have less control over the thermal conditions of their homes. Right? So along with my students in my lab, we've been conducting interviews and oral histories with residents of Watts to learn about how they experience the heat, right? And we're still in the process of analyzing these interviews, but I wanted to share with you a bit of some of the kind of preliminary data, let's call it, that we've kind of gotten. So we learned from one Watts resident about her son fainting on a sweltering playground at school. And in fact, many of these school playgrounds in Watts are amongst the hottest places in Watts. Another resident explained that they were unable to sit at bus stands, which lacked shelter, so they were exposed to high temperatures as they waited. A few residents explained that walking down the street during the day, there were very few trees, so had little protection from the sun. Watts, again, if you compare it to, for example, areas that are wealthier, has far fewer trees, far less canopy cover, right? Mount Washington, for example, in LA, is a place kind of lush with trees, right? Westwood, where UCLA is located, also lush with trees and also lush with bus shelters, right? Another woman explained that her husband experienced a heart attack at work on a particularly hot day, and she continued to wonder, when she talked to us about whether it had to do something with heat, right? And this again speaks to how hard it is to pinpoint particular cases of heat-related illness, which often look like a variety of other kinds of conditions. It's also exacerbated by the fact that heat piggybacks off of what we might think of as pre-existing conditions, right? So it's one thing to say, in a given year we have an excess mortality of 1,000, 2,000, et cetera, and we can say those are probably heat-related. But it's really hard to say in any given condition, did so-and-so die of heat? Did so-and-so get this illness? Or are they having a heart attack because of the heat, right? So description of particular cases remains incredibly challenging. And I will say, I was in India 2 weeks ago. I was talking to a physician about whether he diagnoses heat-related illnesses, given that India is hot and getting hotter. And he said no. He said, it's illogical, it's not possible, but we don't actually, and he works across several hospitals. He says, I never see heat-related illnesses. And he said, I think the reason why is that we're under the spell of a kind of epidemiological transition. We think we've gone from infectious diseases to lifestyle conditions. So when we see these conditions like heart attacks, we think, oh, this is a heart attack. We don't think about it as climate-related. So there's a fundamental question here about how we kind of rethink really basic premises in medicine about what is climate caused, right? How do we think about climate as a kind of an etiological factor in making people sick or making people die, right? So during our interviews in Watts, we heard repeatedly about the lack of access to cooling technologies in people's homes. One resident explained that she lived in Jordan Downs, a public housing effort, or a public housing structure that's pictured here. It was originally built for workers during World War II in a unit without, and she lived in a unit without air conditioning. Redevelopment efforts currently underway by the Housing Authority of Los Angeles promise that new units will have air conditioning. Yet having an air conditioning in your home is not enough. Many Watts residents who actually had air conditioners hesitated to use them, right? They told us, you live with it when things that you would use to combat the heat, you just can't afford because of money. So Watts residents, basically, they were worried about the energy costs, right? What's referred to as energy poverty. So many residents relied heavily on fans, which are generally cheaper. However, they can actually increase heat stress. So in conditions that are both hot and dry, fans can actually recirculate hot air. They don't actually make you necessarily cooler. We interviewed a member of the LA City Council about what sorts of heat-specific interventions might be possible in Watts and other kind of redline areas in Los Angeles. When asked specifically about installing air conditioners or even subsidizing energy bills, he warned that his fellow city council members would not be convinced because for them, cooling was a luxury, right? But in places like, and this is also the logic used in carceral facilities, right? The idea is that if you were to provide air conditioning for inmates, for folks in ICE detention centers, you'd be soft on crime, soft on kind of immigration policy, right? And it's not understood that these are kind of necessities for life, or maybe it is, and that's the point, right? I think in some sense the cruelty is the point, actually. So in places like Watts, cooling is not a luxury, but a necessity, but one that is largely unavailable. So I want to end by asking, what does thermal justice look like for food truck workers or for the residents of Watts? So for food truck workers, it might mean valuing worker safety alongside food safety. It might mean developing new regulations that keep in mind the economic realities of food truck workers and owners. It might mean redesigning food trucks, but also interventions focused on undercutting ideas about racialized heat resilience. It might also involve subsidizing food truck workers, food trucks owned by low-income folks that also provided benefit by allowing us to eat outside, something that became increasingly valuable during the pandemic. So in thinking about the forms of interventions necessary in Watts, we have to consider what might have an immediate impact, so things like bus shelters, trees, air conditioning, subsidized power, and so on. But we also have to consider interventions that address long-standing racial and economic inequalities, for example, pumping money into low-income schools. And we also know, of course, that schools without air conditioning in hotter areas, there is real learning loss, right? And students both learn less and underperform on exams, and that kind of sets them up for kind of a long life of always kind of being behind on this, right? Sorry, I lost. Whenever I go on a tangent, I lose my place, of course. So, for example, pumping money into low-income schools or helping Black and brown folks get better jobs or own their homes so that they have more control over their immediate thermal environments. At the same time, we have to avoid forms of predatory lending that have further harmed Black communities in particular, right? So the answer is not simply to say, well, give people loans to buy homes, but then we give them loans that are just going to screw them over even more, right? So my very broad answer is that thermal justice must consider both immediate conditions and more long-standing structural concerns. Thermal justice can only happen when you ask people what they need, rather than assuming you already know the answers, right? This became very clear in Watts when people worried about gentrification, right? So, the people will say, well, if you plant all these trees and make it nice and fancy, white folks will move in, right? Then we won't be able to live here anymore. So how do we kind of balance those kinds of concerns, take them seriously, and consider what is the kind of climate solution here that also deals with other kinds of realities? So my kind of final point, and maybe this is obvious by now, is that thermal justice must be racial and economic justice, or it's not justice at all. Thank you.
We can step up on the stage and do our thing. So, thank you all for absolutely riveting presentations. I was literally on the edge of my seat. But I have a question that speaks, I think, to all of you in different ways, which is that what I'm maybe more to Bharat and Julie, but I think also to Matt, which is that climate change really seems to dissolve the boundaries between human bodies, minds, and landscapes, right? So what I learned from your work is that our individual health is profoundly affected by our surroundings, kind of like it or not. Does this call for like a new way of thinking of health entirely? And if so, I hear you calling for like new forms of scholarship, but also new kinds of politics. Maybe that's too vague of a question, but would any of you like to speak to that?
Do you want to start?
Yes, we do need that. I think we have a problem in medicine in general, which has, made so many spectacular advances, so much amazing knowledge, but has become so increasingly hyper-specialized that for any of us, any of you who have navigated your way through the health system, you just wish that there was a quarterback who knew what this person was doing and that person was prescribing and this test was saying and could coordinate it somehow. And you're often left kind of between those various poles. And when you scale that up to the level of public health, it does not go away. And then when you take it outside of the confines of the human body and start to think about these kinds of broader interactions and implications that on the one hand are both socioeconomic and environmental, biochemical, et cetera, you can see how complicated the problem gets. So I think as we've become more and more specialized, it's become more and more difficult for us to communicate across those specializations and to figure out how they interact with one another. And I think, again, that our linear modes of reasoning have to fall by the wayside in order to grapple with the complexity at hand. We can see that happening in medicine. We see it through comorbidities because so many people have more than one disease at once. We see it through the microbiome. We see it through epigenetics and kinds of contingent reasoning. We can see it in multiple ways. It's not single input, single expression anymore, but we don't yet have the systems that respond, whether it's the insurance system, the way the hospital is structured, the knowledge patterns, et cetera, that help us kind of realize what that means in a more sophisticated way.
Yeah. And I don't think they're meant to, right? I think they're built for older models of knowledge and knowledge production and also existing models of capital and profit making, right? I mean, I think To my mind, one of the interesting things, I'm teaching a class right now called climatic medicine, which is an effort to kind of think about how we can take climate seriously as a kind of, and I talked a bit about this just now, how climate change will demand a kind of reformulation of how we do medicine, how we do public health, how we think about the next pandemic and the one after that, right? And there's an older tradition from Hippocrates onwards talking about how environment is so central to our bodies and how they're composed. It was deeply racist and very kind of deterministic, but I think there's a space now to kind of rethink that, to kind of ask, in our present moment, how do we take seriously something like heat or what have you as a kind of cause of serious disease? How do we then reconstruct what it means to be ill, both as individuals, as communities, and what forms of remedy might be available to us, right? Maybe the remedy is not necessarily pharmaceutical, maybe it's infrastructural, maybe it's about how we build, right? And I think, going to this question of specialization, I think one of the things that we are told constantly is that we are unable to understand things, right? Some things are too esoteric and too complicated, and I'm convinced that's not the case. I'm convinced that we can actually understand far more than we often give ourselves credit for, but it does require a willingness to communicate and to learn and to kind of think about how could you understand the effects of heat on the cell, on an organ, on a body, on a community, on a society, on our built environment, on a planet, right? And I think that's something we can all do. I think that's actually something that's within our capacity as humans to understand. But we're often, I think the danger of specialization is that we think that it's only for specialists. I think that in fact, such knowledge is deeply available to us, and it's something that we can understand. Or we need to understand, actually.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that there is an approach called One Health, which is explicitly focused on uniting these different ways of thinking about human health, biodiversity, the health of communities all together. And it's interesting that One Health has been very important in guiding thinking in Europe and within the United Nations. And the US has been curiously absent in adopting that perspective for decades now. And just in the past 3 years, there's been a shift. And so I think we are starting to see that, and not that that's the answer, but that is certainly a more holistic approach that will hopefully provide benefits. And it is alarming to me as a scientist working in this area that if I want to talk about climate change, I go to one funding agency. If I want to talk about human health, I have to go to a different funding agency. Mm-hmm. And why do I have to do that? That doesn't make any sense. If I want to work on climate change and health, why isn't there a place that will take that? And there still isn't. It's actually balkanized and over-specialized, and there's a lot of divisions that don't need to be there. And hopefully, in the very near future, some of those will go away.
Yeah, thank you. These are really helpful to think with. Without asking for Pollyanna-ish solutions, I see fragments of suggestions in each of you. Actually, Matt, I learned from you that huge irrigation areas produce the humidity that makes that landscape more dangerous, right? Because the wet bulb temperature goes up. So that's kind of a landscape level impact on the human body. But I guess, could we imagine the thinking or designing landscapes that are safer and better? And then Bharat, I got from you, housing, a basic question, or street trees, or air conditioners. And Julie, I also was thinking about, okay, so some landscapes are better than others. I mean, without giving solutions, do you have sort of fragments or ideas about what we could collectively do in that regard? Bits and pieces?
I have thoughts, but
Why don't you start then?
Well, just to your first point, just to clarify. So there are some places in the world, India would be one of them, where you have pretty hot temperatures, but they can coincide with relatively high humidity. And in those places, irrigation or trying to add more water, which many places would cool things, actually isn't going to help much, and instead you can actually make heat stress worse in some areas by adding water. Whereas the exact same effort done in Southern California might substantially cool things and be a really good way of dealing with heat stress. So, I mean, that's just one example of the fact that you have to very carefully consider place and consider the built infrastructure, the natural world, and how people are moving around within those environments. And I'll just give you a second example of that. I mentioned air conditioning, and it was also mentioned. Well, air conditioning is great if you're in the room that's being air conditioned. Guess where that heat goes? Out onto the street. And so, can you imagine, cities where everyone who has any money is living in this nice air-conditioned room, and anybody who is out on the street is getting all that heat dumped out onto them. And that gets to this justice issue. So we can be techno-optimists and we can talk about solutions, but we need to think about who benefits and who suffers as we roll out those solutions.
Yeah, I guess I would add to it that, we know we have a major housing crisis in our country. It looks different here than it does in New York City, where it is palpable, it is visible, it is everywhere you look, and you know that you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Same if you go to San Francisco or LA, it's palpable, but we know it's happening everywhere. So we not only need to be thinking about how are we going to house people in ways that facilitate healthy environments for them to live, to grow up in, to raise their children, to live their lives, but also how they're going to access them. In solving that problem, we can't simply turn to, giant congregate shelters or to the 3 days out of the year where we decide it's too hot or too cold and people have to be taken into temporary places. It's part of one larger, really significant problem that we have around housing. And then in order to do that, I think we have to name the other thing, which is we have a lot of houses that are enormous and maybe don't get a lot of use, but are pumping out the jam 24/7, raising the temperature when there are other people with no housing at all. I mean, there has to be certain forms of redistribution that have to happen if we are going to make our way out of the untenable solution in which we live. So when we talk about the built environment and housing, on the one hand, I feel like we have to look down to places where people are improperly housed. And we also have to look up to people who maybe are a little maximally housed. And maybe don't need to be.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think part of the difficulty is determining how you define the problem, right? So I think if the problem is the urban heat island, there's a different solution than if the problem is climate change writ large. If the problem is really hot schools, there's a different solution than if the problem is really hot homes or factories or workplaces or agricultural fields in California, Oregon, Washington. If we want to talk about, for example, what's happening in carceral facilities, one possible solution is to say, well, air conditioning. Another possible solution is to say, well, the heavy use of psychotropic drugs means that people are less aware of how hot they're getting and less able to thermoregulate. So you could say stop the drugs, or you could say abolish prisons, right? And so the question is, how do you define the terms of the problem and understand that these problems aren't, the carceral system is a climate problem, right? And so the solution might not be air conditioning or kind of carbon sequestration or what have you. The solution might be something as simple and seemingly impossible in some ways as abolishing prisons, right? So I think we need to kind of think creatively about what counts as a climate solution. Yeah.
I think that's a fantastic point, right? Is that a lot of things that don't look like climate change greatly impact how we experience climate change. In fact, I think I should turn to our audience who may have been gathering questions and patiently waiting while we sit on stage. So I don't know if we have any packages of questions for me to channel, or we have questions from the Zoom room.
All right. So Daniel asks, and I think this is directed toward Matthew, how reliable are climate models? Have they been able to reasonably predict current climate patterns based on past data?
Yeah, so that's always a very valid question. Climate models actually do a really good job of reproducing current climate, and they have been validated by having them reproduce the observed climate change over the past 150 years, and they do an excellent job at that. And part of what I have spent my career doing is taking them back to periods in, millions of years in the past to see how well they do there. And the answer is the uncertainties get bigger the further back you go, but they do a pretty good job in the past as well. So they seem to be fit for purpose, and that's why we use them.
Do we have some other questions from the floor or from the Zoom room? I think there's a microphone coming around, perhaps.
Hi, thank you. I really appreciated your talk, and I understand that the future looks quite bleak, but in terms of the human body digesting all of these drugs that are overprescribed and endemic at this point, and putting them back into the environment, is there a way that we can kind of reverse that process and step that down besides just overprescription? Or at this point, is there too much of that, like those types of drugs in the environment, and will it just be a persistent cycle?
It looks like some amount of it is persistent. So, for example, they've done studies in like a freshwater lake in Uppsala, Sweden, and you can see in the sediment anti-anxiety drugs from 1970. They can date them, and then you can see them accumulating over time. So there's a certain amount of it that's there, and it's not just the drug in its pure form that can be there, but it can also be its metabolites, so elements of its chemical structure that have broken down that are also persistent. But it is possible, I believe, to improve aspects of our wastewater treatment that to try to remove more of these chemicals when they enter the system before they're released. So the ones that are there would appear to be there. I'm not a specialist in how you would remove them from the environment, but they've migrated far enough that I think that that's challenging to think about. But there are ways to kind of narrow the amount of it that's excreted. But by the same token, while these drugs help us, they don't help us at the scale at which we're ingesting them. And we're ingesting them globally at really, really high rates. And at a certain point, I think we probably need to have a conversation about why and what that means. And that will require thinking about the human body and the aquatic environment together as a single problem, rather than having them split in that way. But thank you for your question. I think it's a good one. I mean, you guys have a really fantastic wastewater treatment plant here, which is also a cogen facility. I mean, it's what you want, but it's not clearing them. So I think it would be far down the line for us to be retooling these plants in that way.
I think.
All right, we have another from the Zoom room.
Oh, okay.
And this is directed for Bharat. On a biochemical level, cells respond to heat stress by making a special set of proteins called, quote, heat shock proteins, HSPs. The production of HSPs correlates with increased survival to high temperatures, a phenomenon called, quote, acquired thermotolerance, unquote. Have you investigated changes in the biochemistry of people exposed to heat and the way people prepare themselves for high temperatures?
That's a really interesting question. I wish you would ask me this like 2 months from now. So with my colleague Hannah Landecker, we have this, I hope it's not Hannah asking, we have this project underway to kind of look at the history of heat shock proteins and understand kind of the evolution of that, kind of thinking about a kind of decentralized model for how the body responds to heat, right? Because oftentimes we think about things like the hypothalamus as kind of regulating body temperature through thermoregulation. We think about larger processes of acclimatization, although those are often kind of underspecified in terms of mechanisms that lead to it. So I don't have a good answer for you right now about those proteins. I will say more generally, I am quite interested in processes of acclimatization and what that kind of looks like, what are its limits. I'm also really interested in the kind of discourse around acclimatization, like the idea that bodies can adapt to kind of these adverse heat conditions, specifically because they have real impacts in the present. So just to kind of give you an example, if you are coming up from Central America to work in fields in California, OSHA regulations, kind of occupational health regulations, require that people have a certain amount of time to acclimatize to the environment here, right? So if you're going to be working in a strawberry field, for example, you can't just go full on day one, X number of hours, right? There's supposed to be a certain amount of time you have to acclimatize to that. You're supposed to have certain, access to breaks, to water, so on and so forth. A lot of these regulations are flooded in practice with some consistency because for a variety of things. One, if you're undocumented, it's difficult to actually feel like you can go and complain about your employer and what's happening there. You might not feel like you can take breaks because if you take breaks, you might not meet a quota and make enough money. So there are those kinds of issues around regulation and its enforcement, but there's also these deeper issues about what we think a normal body is, right? So these models that we have about acclimatization and how bodies respond to heat are often premised upon this kind of universalized normal body, right? Historically, these have been largely white bodies. A lot of them have been US soldiers, actually young soldiers in their 20s, really fit. None of that describes me, for example, probably most of us in this room. And so the data we have about what's dangerous is often normed to a specific kind of body. And so, for example, there isn't a ton of work about how people with different kinds of disabilities respond to heat, right? So what might be presumed to be safe might not be so safe for a lot of folks, right? So these kinds of questions about variation between humans and between our bodily conditions is really important to me. It's something I'm trying to kind of figure out how to do more of, and I think a lot of that will happen through collaborations with amazing colleagues, right? But yeah, ask me again in a few months and I'll come up with a better answer, hopefully.
Actually, I'd like to follow up on that because I work on the other end of that problem. So HSPs introduce a cascade through the body that as long as there's not too many of them, promote adaptation on this time scale of days to weeks, so that you can go from being relatively maladapted to heat stress to better adapted over the course of a couple weeks, and it's mediated through this HSP cytokine cascade through the body. All of that helps you reach kind of a hypothetical perfect state for a mammal. But all mammals share the same upper limit. It goes all the way back to 100 million years ago, and we have a different internal body temperature, for example, than birds. But they all have the same maximum temperature, and that limit is not actually subject to further adaptation, except on evolutionary time scales. So you can take somebody up to a certain point through what people think of as adaptation, but it's not evolutionary adaptation. It's just becoming better at being who you are. And then past that, HSPs just kill you. They also happen to be mutagens, and flooding your body with mutagens is generally not considered a great idea. So, it may actually be that part of the role that they've played evolutionarily is when you bump up against these high temperature limits, that they're actually acting to encourage a little bit of evolution to happen. But that's a very slow process. So it helps you get up to a point, but then they stop being effective.
So I think that unfortunately we're just about at time, so I'm just going to thank you all for these wonderful... Oh, one more question. Yes, indeed. Yes. I'm so sorry. Yes.
I can make it quick. I was just wondering from this group, I'm a statistician, and I would really love a concrete definition of a heat wave. We're getting warmer. It's the extremes that drive things. Matthew, you gave us some wet bulb argument. Why can't we get this simple thing straight and fixed in the literature?
Well, there's a lot of different perfectly reasonable definitions of heat wave, the 95th or 99th percentile exceedance value of temperature, heat index, or wet bulb. You can pick the metric of choice and pick the extreme value, and it's fine.
I don't want a quantile because that's changing. I want to...
Well, you pick the existing quantile, and then you look at exceedances over that. So you don't change the quantile. You pick that number, and then that's your threshold moving forward. And
for how long? Duration? Magnitude?
Yeah, so we have papers where we've quantified all that. And the nice thing is it scales. So in other words, if you warm the world by 1 degree, I can tell you how the 95th percentile will vary. In wet bulb, it will change by 0.8 degrees because there's a simple thermodynamic scaling. So there is a literature on that, and it's pretty robust.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all, and I'll pass a hand over to Paul Koch to finish up for us.
I'm not mic'd, so can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Great, now people in the ether, can you hear me? I hope so. So again, I want to thank the speakers. Really stimulating. I'm here to offer a few thoughts on what I heard and maybe try to pull it together. I should say, I'm Paul Koch. I'm the Dean of Physical and Biological Sciences for a couple more months. And I'm also a paleoclimatologist. I study ancient climates and their effect on life. So I have some insight into this. But I guess what I'll say is the thing that I heard, and Matthew kicked it off, was kind of the power of language and in understanding and being able to even see things, right? And if you can't, well, by naming, you can change the way your brain works, right? By thinking, by using words and talking, you can change what you see and what you understand. And Matthew started us on that. Julie really named some things that were hard, and but they're true. And being able to know that they're there requires that you hear them, that you hear about them, to understand the interconnections that she was covering. You have to hear them, and you have to be able to, if you're going to be able to see them. And in particular, the comment about pathologizing despair when it might be in some sense an adaptive response, to me was a powerful insight. I also, I'm trying to get my head around ultra life. But as one experience, now this, I may not be right about this, but I'm just going to say it because it resonates with what Julie was mentioning. There's 7 billion people on Earth today, and there were 3 billion people on Earth not too long ago. Like, where does that matter come from? Like, how can there be so many people? And something like half the nitrogen in our bodies comes from industrial production, from the Haber-Bosch, like from taking methane and N2 gas in the atmosphere, an incredibly strong triple bond, hard to break those nitrogen atoms apart. But we figured out how to do it. It was figured out in the beginning of the last century. And that's like half of the nitrogen in our bodies just walking around was made industrially in societies like ours. So that's a very clear example of the way that the energy industry has made us, not just like made the world, literally made our mass. And then for Bharat, I guess I would say that I was thinking about words, but then the image of the fan pullers, hammered home what visuals can do as well in understanding where we are and how we got here and what we might need to do to get out of it. And I really liked the ending on a definition of what thermal justice might be. It goes back to envisioning, naming something that is not here today, but something that we could get to. So that's just some very high level, like the things that came into my head as I heard these amazing presentations and the exchange that Andrew and the questions brought at the end. So I want to thank you all for coming. I want to. I didn't do it. Okay. If you want to engage more with thinking about climate and our response to it, or let's just say even to anthropogenic change, the things humans do to the planets, I encourage you to engage with the deep read that the campus is promoting, that we're sponsoring. Elizabeth Colbert will be talking about her book, which I read half of, and then I lost it. And so I bought a second copy. I didn't lose it. I left it at one of my former grad students' houses, so she's understanding it at UC Merced right now. And this book talks about not just climate, but how we're trying to manipulate the world in response to the things that we've done to it, and oftentimes the biological world. And it's going to be a wonderful. Elizabeth Colbert will be here on the 21st of May in the Quarry. In the Quarry, speaking in conversation with Ezra Klein about this book. And so for those of you there in the ether who don't have tickets to the event, I encourage you to get it. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye to the folks on Zoom and ask the folks here in the room to hold on for a minute, and I'll say a few more words for y'all. So thank you all.